Ladies and gentlemen, my fellow Americans, welcome to The Means with Dan Vrabel, your very own unscripted weekly podcast of the people, by the people, and for the people. And as our first inaugural official episode, I would like to welcome you and personally express my gratitude for you joining us on this journey to not only enhance our own knowledge, but to bring you the true, honest news for the American people and the people of the world. Thank you. This week has, now that we've got that out of the way, this week has been quite the eventful one, with plenty of matters of inquiry to address, issues to fundamentally resolve, and political matters to further dive into. As we have seen our country near 100 days of the second Trump administration, a global stage that has been marred by instability, and an economy that has, frankly, for lack of a better vernacular, not been doing so hot. So let's get into it. I'm your host, Dan Vrabel. First and foremost, we have seen the tragic passing of Pope Francis in this week, following Easter Sunday and a meeting with Vice President J.D. Vance. Now, I say this coming from a family that has not traditionally been parochially inclined. Pope Francis was always a figure that I greatly and deeply admire, and I think his death is, for me at least, a tragic occurrence and a very tragic thing. I can recall even back as a kid, mind you, I did not come from a clerical or parochial family. I can recall hearing stories of the man's great humility and kindness, especially when compared with our president at the time, Donald Trump. And I think he meant a great deal to a great many people, and he sought to reform the church after a very difficult chapter in its history with the resignation of his predecessor Benedict and a litany of scandals. Yet, his papacy was not one that brought unanimous agreement amongst the Catholic and wider world. Yet, the conclave to elect his successor is set to meet in the next several weeks, and I can assure you all that it will be quite an event to observe. As the betting markets and wider popular speculation has further devolved, I would like to at this time go over some of the candidates who seek to become, or since this is not a traditional election and you cannot really express your interest to run, who are suspected to be a candidate for the next pontiff. Sorry, it's interesting looking at papal elections. It's not like many of the conventional Western elections in which a candidate announces they are running and seeks to campaign for popular support. No, the papal conclave is determined by a secret vote of cardinals who are not allowed, at least in theory, to discuss the next candidate for pope, but instead vote anonymously and without discussion on who they think will be the best among them to be pontiff. However, there are, as suspected and recorded in a number of cardinal journals, a significant amount of backroom dealing and negotiations to determine the next pontiff. Yet it is a process that has encapsulated the entire world's attention, and I can assure you it will be one for the ages, as progressive and conservative factions of the church vie for control and the next pope. Perhaps the frontrunner at the moment, as indicated by both betting markets and wider consensus, would be the Dean of Cardinals Pietro Parolin, who has served as the foreign liaison for the papacy, negotiating with foreign governments, namely the Chinese, to secure the independence of Catholic bishops in China, as well as other nations, and thus has a rather impeccable foreign standing amongst secular leaders. He has been supported as a fairly non-divisive candidate who represents what can safely be called compromise. He has been looked at as a sort of bridge between the more progressive and conservative factions of the church. Yet his candidacy is not necessarily one that will go uncontested, as of course there are many far more ideologically inclined cardinals who have at very least been listed as papabili or papable by many onlookers and observers. Namely, we have Cardinal Tagle out of the Philippines, who has been a lead close confidant amongst and of Pope Francis' progressive faction of the Church, and has been known for his fairly progressive theology. Yet there has been a fair degree of question if the Catholic Church would want such an outspokenly liberal cardinal and a liberal theologian to head the Church in this new session. For there is the old aphorism, out with the fat pope, in with the thin pope. And this aphorism mainly implies that when a pope of one ideological or theological persuasion, let's say for the sake progressive, leaves the papacy, their successor tends to be of the opposite ideological persuasion. We saw this with Pope Benedict, who was a notable conservative, replaced by the progressive Pope Francis, or with the dilemma between the two Pope John Pauls. However, the former John Paul did not have a very long tenure as Pope. But beyond all of the history and nuance, we have seen Tagle emerge as a progressive candidate, yet he has been far from receiving a warm welcome, as many more conservative theologians and cardinals have been very skeptical of a man as progressive and outspokenly forward-thinking for the Church as Tagle, on stances such as immigration, wider diplomacy, and the role of the Church in condoning inclusion, which has been a highly divisive issue for the Church, and one that, frankly, I would be curious to see how it turns out. Yet I must admit I have little to no horse in this game. On the conservative end of the papal election, we have seen Cardinal Erdo out of Hungary, who has been noted for his close ties to the administration of Viktor Orban and the right-wing push in recent years throughout the continent of Europe. He has been noted for calling a restoration of traditional church values prior to the Second Vatican Council, noted for being a reputable traditionalist and a fairly acclaimed papal scholar. He has emerged with his own support of a traditional faction, yet interestingly, much of his support has been deteriorated by not only calls for a potential compromise candidate, such as Parolin, but also amongst fellow traditionalists, notably Robert Sarra, the cardinal out of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, Sarra, he is a very interesting character, I'll say. He has been noted for his rabid encouragement of evangelical practices by the Catholic Church, and I say evangelical not to refer to the American denomination, but more to refer to the larger push of proselytizing and missionary work. He has been noted for saying that Christianity are and is the philosophical roots of the West, and I quote, "Without roots, all trees die." So he has made himself noted as a fairly outspoken reactionary and traditional candidate. Beyond that, there are minor candidates, Zuppi out of Italy, who has served as a moderate conservative, and Peter Tuxen out of Ghana, who, although noted for similar evangelical work, which, as I can attest, is a fairly common trait amongst African Christians and Catholics, that evangelical notion. I am unsure whether it's a cultural matter or simply a philosophical outlook of the missionary philosophy, but it has become fairly popular amongst that branch of the church. Yet, I apologize for we have divulged for quite a while on the matter of the church. It seems that the conclave will likely go on for several ballots and will not be resolved on the first vote. However, if I had to put my money on a single candidate, I would very comfortably say Parolin. He is a compromise candidate. He is seen as a widely experienced and pragmatic papal potential, and he has that certain ability to negotiate with secular leaders, which in an increasingly secular world is what one who wishes to expand papal influence would desire. Personally, I don't really have any skin in the game, and I think whoever ends up assuming the pontificate the pontiff will end up doing perhaps a decent job, but if I had to say who I would prefer, I would say I'm slightly inclined to Cardinal Tagle. But ultimately, I think what everybody is hoping for is a peaceful and a widely accepted outcome to this year election. Now, moving on to domestic news, we can assert that although the American government may not have been the most fond of Francis, it has been very, very rare in the last century for foreign governments and secular governments to exert a large influence on papal elections. Yet it has been noted that some of the American branches of government would prefer a less ideologically controversial pope, and it has also been of my personal opinion that any pontiff who respects the supremacy of American law and tradition would be preferable to one who doesn't. But beyond the obvious, Trump, President Trump, this week has shown a rather almost depressingly comical degree of weakness in response to the increased Russian bombings of Ukraine, Kiev namely, in the largest bombing spree and largest bombing offensive since the war began 3 years prior. Trump responded via a Twitter post, because I am not calling it X, in which he stated, and I quote, "Vladimir, stop. I cannot support this." And then went on to beg the Russian despot to end this war. Now, President Trump's negotiating tactics have been to largely isolate our Western allies, abandon the American duty, and cuddle up to Russian dictatorship. Frankly, I think it's a disgrace, and the fact is, the most conservative Republican would have gawked at the idea of backing down in the face of foreign, especially Russian tyranny 20 or even 10 years ago. So I, for one, am rather amazed to see this sudden turnabout and about face within the Republican Party. This weakness has not only been extended towards the Russian adversary, but it has also been extended towards El Salvador, what was once a banana republic which has now been taken over by leader Nayib Bukele, who has risen in the span of the last couple years from a trendy social media utilizing mayor of San Salvador, the capital city of El Salvador, to become the president and now autocrat of the small Latin American state, and has been noted for his aggressive combatants of organized crime. And I, for one, would like to say, to oppose and to prevent myself from looking too partisan, I did support Bukele's push against crime. I was overjoyed to see a man come down so hard on the cartels and organized crime syndicates. Yet, he has blatantly and objectively neglected due process, and he has failed to actively address the necessary legitimacy that a republic must have when fighting evil. For when one fights evil, and when one fights the evils of crime, let's say a cartel, they have a fundamental obligation not only to eradicate this evil, but to be sure they do so in a legitimate way. For if we do not respect the rule of law and the fundamental difference between us and these, pardon my French, these animals, then how different are we? It is that difference that allows for us to claim not only legitimacy, but to claim the right to bring these men to justice. You see, this involves many things: due process, the rule of law, respecting the courts, and going after with the fundamental presumption of innocence. Now, this doesn't mean you let him go. No, we have been able to, for centuries, actively eradicate and bust crime rings while still honoring the presumptions of innocence and due process. All it means is you can't be in too much of a hurry and a rush. And trust me, I say this with a fervent desire to break up any and all facets of organized crime in this country, namely the emergence of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. So I say to those who are in the law and order crowd, and I put myself included, let us eradicate crime, but let us do so with a sense of justice, not a sense of vengeance. For justice is made by the pen and the rule of law, not by the sword and by blood. However, Trump has shown weakness to El Salvador in his refusal to request the return of an American citizen from El Salvador's mega prison. Kilmar Garcia, who had been a naturalized American citizen, was mistakenly deported by ICE in the recent raids. Now, this has been a rather complex issue because you've seen people on both ends of the political spectrum advocate on one hand for neglecting due process and sending any and all who are suspected to foreign prisons. And you have seen another which has advocated absolute amnesty for illegal immigrants and an abdication of the rule of law. I do not endorse either this extremism of the right or of the communist left, and I think both are fundamentally dangerous to the national fiber. What I think, rather, is that organizations such as ICE or any federal agency have the right to operate in whole, and no state can decline to follow a law that they do not wish to or do not like. However, organizations of the government must operate with legitimacy. We must operate with the fundamental principles and sacred virtues of a republic. This involves, among other things, yes, the rule of law. And I say this as a man with a fervent hatred for organized crime. Without law, without principles, where do we stand? We can talk a lot of talk about safety, security, and eradicating crime. All of these are buzzwords that I love to use, to the annoyance of some of my more permissive friends and associates. But the fact is, if we do not instill a sense of just persecution of crime, then all we are doing is simply seeing who has the biggest gun. Now trust me, I want nothing more than to use the full force of the United States government to break up drug cartels and these foreign syndicates of crime. However, this is not the way to go about doing it. I see the methods that have been used, and frankly, their outcome has only been to fuel more and more people in opposition to what may be a fundamentally good cause, fighting crime. But the method we're doing it is more befitting of a police state or of a despot than it is of the noble American Republic. Furthermore, on a less timeless note, I find it ridiculous that we are sending these criminals to foreign prisons. You see, the Trump and the MAGA crowd have long rallied on the tragedy of outsourcing, a tragedy that is fundamentally a tragic truth. We have lost the industry of steel, of much of our auto industry. We have lost much of the industry throughout the Rust Belt. Industry after industry, sector after sector, has been lost from this country throughout the decades following NAFTA and the trend of outsourcing industry. We have seen millions lose their jobs, their livelihoods, and their sense of American destiny. Yet, the push of the so-called restorationists, the so-called American First crowd, has been to outsource yet another industry. Now, not only have we been outsourcing all of our economic and infrastructure needs to nations such as China and other third world nations, but we have outsourced the prison industry to Latin America. I believe we can fully combat crime, but the fact is, now we are relying on foreign labor to even run our prisons, which I can't help but find hilarious, yet also tragic. We can be able to break up crime and attack the syndicates of organized cartels without relying on a foreign government to do so. We were once the strongest nation on the planet, a world superpower, judged not by strength, but by humanity's sake and our commitment to bettering the world. Now we stand here, not even able to get our own citizens back from a foreign prison that we outsourced our labor to. We outsourced the job of housing criminals to a foreign prison, an idea that has not only been lauded by the Trump administration, but has been suggested as a potential outcome for more housing of prisoners and criminals, citizen or not, which fundamentally is not only unconstitutional, not only is a violation of due process, but fundamentally is un-American. The fact is, we can have our own mega prisons. And I say this not without great sadness, but I fear we are losing our own legitimacy when we seek to rely on a foreign nation and a foreign dictatorship that we have given a nuclear program to just to house a couple prisoners. I think it's a tragedy, but Trump's weakness, it goes on. We have seen a man who has called himself the strong force to make America great again. But what has he actually done? What has he actually done for the average American? Frankly, the tragic thing is his rhetoric, I feel, it has addressed a truth that has been long neglected by this nation's elite, by the often liberal coastal elite. That there have been millions of Americans who have felt and fundamentally been left behind in the recent decades. They've been left behind by poverty, by a sense of corruption in government, by special interests running our government, by the loss of industry and labor, as following NAFTA and further foreign trade deals that were lopsided, we lost millions of jobs. And this fundamental sense of a loss amongst the American people and the red-blooded working class American was what fundamentally fueled the MAGA movement to become so powerful. This didn't just come out of nowhere. Trump knew and fundamentally still does know how to scratch and tickle the back of the working class American exceptionally well. And I'll admit, I am not immune to this. He has been able to tickle the back of the American in such a way that can rile you up. Although it has that sort of charisma, that's actually quite a good way to put it. Sort of charisma. He says the things that some think in the back of their mind as just a odd, nutty thought. But he addresses a problem, a very real problem, and that is millions of Americans have been left behind. They have felt left behind by an economy that no longer works for them, and by a culture they feel no longer in touch with. So although Trump does address this issue, he presents some of the worst solutions possible that fundamentally not only bamboozle good, hardworking Americans, but go directly against their and our interests. The fact is, Trump rallied against NAFTA and then passed his own near-identical trade deal to replace NAFTA, the USMCA, or the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which essentially remained identical to NAFTA and has only served to continue removing federal jobs and industry. He has not served to help the American worker. He has not served to combat foreign dominance of the production market. Nay, he has only served to further devolve America's standing economically. He has spoken also about restoring America's strength on the world stage. There has been no strength. We have upended 80 years of a Western Republican order, an order centered around an empire of liberty, an ideal that Thomas Jefferson spoke of, Abe Lincoln dreamed of, Teddy Roosevelt fought for, and Franklin Roosevelt secured. Hell, even Ron Reagan fought for it. But we have seen that all go away. We have seen that fundamental Western order and that American leadership of the Democratic Front gone with the wind, as we have seen Donald Trump and the American government not only betray and abandon our allies, but actively support the forces of tyranny. As we have abandoned the American duty to the point where not only our allies have felt alienated, not only have we lost our standing on the world stage, not only have we lost our position as the leader of the West and as the Western superpower, but in the push of Trump's so-called movement for sovereignty, we have seen Europe and much of the Western world not only break up the Western order, with trade between Japan, South Korea, and China being formed, breaking up the West's fundamental hold in East Asia, but we have seen Europe largely begin to pick up where we left off, with voices such as Emmanuel Macron and Friedrich Merz, the soon-to-be Chancellor of Germany, emerge where once the speakers such as Clinton, Bush, Obama, hell, even Biden, and I don't like the guy, would speak as leaders of the West. For, like them or not, America was the leader of the West, yet we have largely lost this fundamental standing on account of one man's desire to eradicate the Western Republican order. We have seen this weakness in dealings with Russia, in dealings with other nations, but perhaps no area has this weakness been greater revealed than in the tariff issue. For we have seen Donald Trump enact tariffs across the board, impacting every nation, allies and opponents alike, to the point where, within the span of a couple weeks, the United States of America lost 20% of our overall wealth, only for these tariffs to be slowed down and pulled back in a sudden turnabout. Now, this is not only a show of great weakness, for we went from having across the board tariffs on all industry and all nations to having tariffs on only one nation, the People's Republic of China, which is not for the people, not a republic, could barely even be called a legitimate Chinese state. But yet, we went from having tariffs on everybody, only on China, to barely any tariffs at all. We went from one extreme to the absolute other. We backtracked to the point where all we have done is squandered a fifth of our wealth and made a great fool of ourselves and our economy. For our stability is no stronger, and our worker is no more benefited than they had been before. No, this strikes me only as a move of weakness, and a rather sad move that better befits a 12-year-old playing a game of Risk than the President of the United States. Now, about the idea of tariffs, I would like to make myself clear. I don't oppose tariffs. I think selective tariffs on certain developing industries and tariffs on certain countries which have developed a monopoly in exports are beneficial. Tariffs, for example, on China, or tariffs on industries that we are trying to develop in America, serve to benefit the American worker and consumer alike. For with these selective tariffs, we are able to fundamentally help the American worker by giving them not only an incentive, but a leg up in their fundamental business. For the business of the American people is business. Yet we have neglected that in squandering a fifth of our wealth in the span of a couple weeks. For this was not a healthy tariff. These tariffs were across the board for every single nation, ally or adversary. We tariffed the nations who have been our fundamental supporters, backers, allies, and followers. We have alienated them, we have destroyed our own industry, and we have made a fool of ourselves and changed our position from the leaders of the free world to Saturday Night Live come to life. Hell, I've seen the recent news headlines. They look more like an Onion post than the actual real world. And it's a tragedy. It really is. But these tariffs went from being on everybody, which was a poor move, a move that I personally would never have made, nor would anybody else in their right mind have made. They went from that to tariffs on China, which I would fundamentally support given the immense reliance and dependence that we have come to have on them for exports, which is fundamentally unhealthy and ought to be weaned off of. But these tariffs were hasty. They did not allow for a proper devolution and a proper rebalancing of the wider economic climate. No, they merely allowed for a lot of loss on the hands of the Americans and on the hands of the American with a stake in the market. I mean, we saw a fifth of our wealth go away. This grand tragedy has only served but to make a laughingstock and a fool of ourselves. His rhetoric has bamboozled a lot of good Americans. We have seen a man who has attempted to portray himself as the hero of the forgotten American, who will make America. But he has not done that, nothing close to it. He has taken advantage of the working American, and he has fundamentally made a mockery of the American people. He has made a mockery of those who put their faith in them, these good, honest Americans. And frankly, it makes me sick. Beyond this tariff blunder, we have seen his appointment of grossly inadequate cabinet members, namely Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who, in brighter news, seems to be going on the way out, as rumors are spreading that Trump is looking for a replacement candidate, who could be anyone from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to a more experienced actual military personnel. But we will see. Hegseth, who largely earned notoriety as a host on Fox and Friends, would become the Secretary of Defense earlier this year, only winning the nomination by a tie-breaking vote in the Senate by Vice President J.D. Vance. Yet, his tenure has been noted for one thing: the leaks. Yes, these leaks have made a great mockery of himself and the American Defense Department, for he leaked American war plans and he leaked American strategy in combating the radical Islamist group, the Houthis, to a chat that was later leaked to the press. This is the sort of nonsense that you would not believe 10 years or even 5 years ago. And frankly, it is a great tragedy that this has become the reality of the American state. Yet I, for one, am proud to encourage Trump to replace Hegseth. And I can say just about anybody, with maybe the sole exception of Mike Lindell, will be better than the guy we have now. Having said that, Pete Hegseth has, in the midst of these rumors, stated that he will not back down and has been pure in not only his intentions, but in putting America first. To that I say the timeless aphorism that my father always served to remind me: the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Good intentions indeed. As we have seen this action, we have seen in lighter news Trump attempt to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, in the Vatican for the Pope's funeral. Now, although this meeting was admittedly far less confrontational than their previous, now notorious White House meeting, I cannot help but be a skeptic at how this shall play out and how this shall impact not only the American people, but the wider people of the world in their fight against tyranny and the forces of evil. For Trump has turned his back on Zelensky once before, and frankly, I cannot help but be a skeptic when I say this. I'll believe it when I see it. Beyond that, we have seen in the Democratic Party no better chance at a solution. We have seen a party in total disarray following the absolute devastating defeat of Kamala Harris in 2024, a candidate who I, from the start, was in fundamental opposition to her nomination. Biden and Harris were fundamentally a compromise ticket when they were picked in 2020. And Biden, although having had a rather impressive career in the past as a senator and as vice president to Obama, did not serve well as a president. It's rather a tragedy as I've thought about it. This was a man who had a long career as a statesman, but will be remembered for his last rather senile years. He was a man who, for many years, was looked up to by not only his fellow senators, but people on the left and right. He was known as a moderate, as a rational senator. A man who was so reliable, Obama picked him as his VP and was able to assure many Democrats who were concerned about Obama's nomination that this was a sound ticket. But now he is not remembered as that man. But the point I'm driving at is the Biden-Harris and later Harris-Walz ticket was fundamentally a bad ticket for 2024. And the messaging that they used was fairly alienating in that it served to have an elite rhetoric. It served to appeal to the elite. And it served to further not the interest of the common American, but identity politics and the decaying compromise ticket of 2020. But as many Democrats have sought to posture themselves as potential candidates for 2028, few have gotten more media attention than the hard-left radical congresswoman from New York, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Fun name to say. Now, she has served as the ideological successor to the old leader of the Democratic left-wing faction, Bernie Sanders, as the two have traveled across the country in their fighting oligarchy tour. And although Cortez has managed to rally many allies and many supporters, she is fundamentally not the direction for the Democratic Party. As a card-carrying member of the Democratic Socialists of America, we have seen her denounce America's position on the world stage. We've seen her denounce America's duty. We have seen her denounce a strong American leadership over the Republican bloc. We have seen her oppose any attempts for democracy and stability in the Middle East. We have seen her advocate for radical economic upheaval, and we have seen her advocate for some of the more radical culture war issues that have proven to be immensely unpopular with the American people. Frankly, I do not say this lightly when I think it would be a grave mistake for the Democratic Party to nominate her in 2028. For although she is right on many issues, such as the issue of health care, or the issues of helping the working man and assuaging the conditions of the poor, we have fundamentally seen her adopt far too many radical positions, associate herself with radicals, and alienate her own fellow party members to the point where she is unfeasible as a candidate. Having said that, there have not been many others who have emerged as a suitable candidate. We have seen hopes for a more moderate candidate, such as Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro or Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, both of whom have seemed to keep fairly quiet on the possibility of a run, and I am still questionable on if they will take up the mantle. We have seen speculation for a return of Kamala Harris, which I can say would be worse than anything for the Democratic Party, as we got the rude awakening in 2024 when the many Democratic and fairly elite followers of Harris who had believed she were destined to win by a very large margin were shocked to see her lose in an almost landslide defeat. We have seen potentials floated in the media such as Pete Buttigieg or Cory Booker, or even Gretchen Whitmer, the Michigan governor known for a race with a binder when coming to meet Trump. None of these individuals, although potential statesmen, have really proven themselves as a capable nominee or a candidate who will be able to win over the American people by and large. And I think this is merely a testament to the great sense of disarray that has plagued the Democratic Party following their defeat in 2024. But at this point, the Democrats must learn to speak to the nation and listen to the people and their concerns, and not the concerns of special interests and identity groups. However, I say this with a full degree of confidence. 4 out of 5 Democratic candidates, if you were to pick them at random from a hat, would be better than the current administration we have now. Beyond this, in international electoral news, tomorrow Canada will be holding their snap election, which has been one of the most eventful electoral campaigns in Canadian history. As we have seen in the span of a couple months, the Canadian electoral landscape go from an almost assured landslide defeat for the incumbent Liberal Party of Justin Trudeau to an almost certain landslide for those same Liberals. The situation has largely been facilitated by two main factors. One, the sudden resignation of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, following a tumultuous 10 years at the helm of the Canadian nation-state, and his replacement by the illustrious Mark Carney as head of the Liberal Party. Now, at the time of his resignation, Canadian polls showed Justin Trudeau behind his Conservative opponent, the fairly small government crusader Pierre Poilievre, who was polling 30 points ahead of Trudeau at the time of his resignation. Now, this climate has rapidly been changed by both Carney and the emergence of Trump, who has been purported to be aligned with Poilievre and has been largely associated with Poilievre, whose campaign slogan has been Canada First, largely resembling his American counterpart, and the tariff scandal, which has been immensely unpopular with the Canadian people and has served to embolden the Liberals in Canada. Now, Carney, I must say, I have a fair degree of admiration for. This was a man who was not only head of the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, and various other private equity funds, but he is a well-renowned economist who may be the most illustrious economist and central banker in the world to date, with the sole exception of Sir Mario Draghi, famed for having saved the euro in the financial crisis of the early 2010s. Now, Carney has managed to inherit a candidate that was widely dissatisfied with the state of their nation and has managed to turn things around, now leading over his conservative opponent by nearly 10 points on average in opinion polls. This will ultimately serve to not only cement the Liberal status as the natural governing party of Canada, but should serve as a testament to how widely unpopular Trump's actions were abroad. For Trudeau, the widely unpopular Prime Minister of Canada, and a man who I have personally held a strong disliking for ever since the convoy protests and the freedom convoys of 2021-2, has been replaced by a successor who many deemed to be a mere continuation of Trudeau's policy, but has served to be immensely popular as a pragmatic progressive and a voice for reason. And he has been mostly noted for his stark opposition to Trump, which has won him immense support with the Canadian people. And frankly, if I were a Canadian, although I may have been inclined to support Poilievre when Trudeau was still in office, if I were a Canadian and could vote in tomorrow's election, I would vote Carney. And I say this purely on the fact that his merit is unparalleled and he is only proven to be a rational opponent of a very irrational policy on behalf of my American state. Now, this ought to be a testament to Trump and to his fellow MAGA movement. His actions are not popular, they are not beneficial, and they have failed to help the good, honest American working man. They have failed to help revive good, honest traditions, and they have failed to revive the most important tradition of all, the chief business that is business. Frankly, I think it's a tragedy. We have lost an immense amount of global clout and standing purely on account of the fact that one leader, our leader, has back and forth on decisive economic policy based on the whim of any given day. Frankly, his decision process makes no sense to me, nor does it to a majority of reasonable Americans and the good, honest Americans who have been bamboozled into supporting him. And I can put many into that category. But to alienate these people would be a grave mistake, for they are the lifeblood of this great nation. And they are a people who I feel have been abandoned by the elites who have been known and immensely been associated with the Democratic Party, a party that was once the party of man, but now I fear is no longer so. Lastly, we have seen New York City's mayoral electoral race heat up as we have seen a potential return of former governor and highly controversial Democratic nominee Cuomo, who has sought to return to New York's realm of government on a campaign of affordable housing, moderate progressivism, and tackling crime. He has served as a widely popular opponent to the now independent incumbent mayor Eric Adams, whose campaign and administration has been marred by egregious corruption, so much so that it makes me sick just to think about. However, we have seen not only Cuomo emerge as an opponent, but we have seen the progressive opposition to Adams within the hard left opponent, Zohran Mamdani, who has emerged not only as an open and heavily avowed socialist, but opponent to nearly all of the policies of his admittedly liberal opponents. However, he has been noted in being the primary candidate of the progressive faction of the New York City Democrats. However, he has made many enemies in this campaign trail and is likely to be heavily defeated by former Governor Cuomo in the Democratic primary come this month. Cuomo, I have had very conflicting opinion on for quite a while. Before the scandals came out, I can remember myself being very fond of him, looking at him as a leader of not only the party, but of the rational liberal movement. He made sense, and he was a man who had no sense of alienation towards the common man and very little elitism. He was likable, even though many joked that he did not look presidential. Yet when the scandals broke, his career died almost instantly. So to see him return to the political stage has been somewhat conflicting for me, and has been a nature and an event that I have thought a great deal about. Yet I must say, if I was posed between the candidacies of Adams or Cuomo and Mamdani, I would support Cuomo. Frankly, to call Mamdani a progressive, as he has tried to call himself, would be erroneous, for Mamdani is better befit the label of the radical left than of a rational progressive. And frankly, as someone who enjoys the word progressive, I am not the biggest fan of progressivism being taken hostage as a word and an ideology by radicalism. I think the two are fundamentally and ideologically different, and to associate them together would be doing a grave misjustice to both. In other candidates, we have seen Curtis Sliwa, a moderate anti-Trump Republican who has supported increased welfare programs, set the presumptive Republican nominee for New York City's mayoral race, and independent corporate corruption lawyer Jim Walden emerge as well. Frankly, I think both of these candidates are fairly decent in the race, yet they are fundamentally very unlikely to win, as the Democratic Party has a stranglehold in New York City. Frankly, I shall be looking forward to continue to follow this race as it progresses, and see how this currently five-way race narrows down in the coming weeks and months before the election of this nation's largest, most financially consequential city emerges. Lastly, we have seen an emerging and sudden conflict within India and Pakistan following a terror attack in the contested territory of Jammu and Kashmir, in which both Indian and Pakistani nationals have become increasingly advocating and increasingly supportive of military action. We have seen China back up Pakistan in this conflict in accordance with their increasing opposition to India. And frankly, I see a potential opportunity for America to set things right and oppose any backing of a terrorist harborer or of the Chinese state. Yet, it is very likely that America will not get involved, or if we do get involved on potentially the wrong side, whatever side that may be of such a conflict. Frankly, the outlook may be very grim in the world, but we must remember, it is the fundamental duty of the individual to better themselves, their community, their republic, and the world we live in. And we must remember, just as it is a civilization's duty to look after her government, it is a government's duty to look after her civilization. Thank you all for listening. I'll be in next week to discuss the matters that we have yet to see unfold. I'd like to thank you for joining us on this inaugural venture, and to all of you, have a wonderful evening.